of the atmosphere was. Priestley, of course, with oxygen a little bit earlier, and so they started to measure atmospheric CO2. And what Beck found was the pre-industrial level was in fact around 360 parts per million, and that therefore there's virtually no increase since the pre-industrial level. And the other thing you need to know is that the only source of information of atmospheric CO2 we have now are from Mauna Loa and a few other stations around the world that are all controlled by the Keeling family, who have a patent on the process. Charles Keeling was the first guy to say, CO2 levels are increasing and it's problematic. He's got a patent on it. It's just absolute rubbish. They argue that CO2 from Mauna Loa is representative of the whole world. CO2 varies tremendously around the world, but all of the computer models assume even distribution and so on and so forth. So everything you look at with this is corrupted data, an agenda in the data. The ice core record, which came out in 1991 by Jousel and others, showing that the CO2 level goes up and down with the temperature going back 420,000 years. And they said, there's proof the CO2 changes, the temperature changes. Well, we now know, and everybody agrees, that the temperature changes before the CO2. We also know, and Jaworowski and others have shown it, that the ice core readings are at least 20% low because of the method you have of extracting the gas from the ice bubbles. Every bit of this data that they present simply doesn't bear any even minimal scientific investigation and explanation.
Talk about your new book, or the new book that you participated in.
The problem is I didn't come on to promote the book.
I know, but share a little bit about it, because you had a big role in it, slaying the Sky Dragon.
Well, one of the things that we talked about in an earlier program we mentioned at the beginning of this one is about generalization and specialization. People know about Renaissance people. These are people with a very wide range of knowledge and information about music and the world and everything else. But what is defined as the last universal person is reputed to be an Alexander von Humboldt. Now, von Humboldt was a German geographer who literally went to every continent. He didn't get to Antarctica because it had only been discovered in 1840 by Palmer, the U.S. Navy. But he went to every continent, described the climate, described the patterns, and so on. But he knew all of the physics and biology and chemistry that was known at that time. Now, of course, because of him, ironically, and he's starting to describe, and you start to get National Geographic and geographic societies going out and describing things, and we're learning more and more about the world, the volume of information just became overwhelming. And of course, that volume of information then required theories and explanations and mechanisms, and it just kept proliferating until no one person could possibly accommodate it all. So the idea of being a generalist, and by the way, the term scientist, Darwin was a naturalist. He wasn't a scientist in the definition of his time. But gradually, people became more and more specialized. And I used to joke with my students about it and say, well, how many of you want to specialize? And one student would always put their hand up and say, oh, yeah, what do you want to do? I want to be a doctor. No, that's not a specialization. Sorry. Red blood cells, that's a specialization. And, of course, one of the things you get into with specialization is that the specialist might know a great deal about one small part of the total body, but not understand the dynamics of the whole body. And the story that I love to tell is about the patient lying on the stretcher, and the podiatrist is looking at the feet, and the nephrologist is looking at the kidneys, and the neurologist is looking at the brain, and the nurse is in the corner saying, but doctors, the patient's dead. This is what we've got into. Now, by the way, that problem people experience in their daily lives, because the general practitioner, notice that term, they're expected to know a little bit about all things. But you go with symptoms, they'll identify the symptoms, and then they try to narrow it down by process of elimination. If they can't do it, then they'll send you to a specialist who they think is the one that needs to be able to identify this for you. One of the most famous health clinics in the world, the Mayo Clinic, recognized this problem. So if you go to the Mayo Clinic, the first thing that you're sent there by, or you go with your GPs and your medical files, but the first thing that happens is they start doing a complete battery of tests upon you, and each specialist looking at you and talking to you. But what they do at the end that's different than most other medical situations in the world is all of those specialists sit around at the end and compare notes. And at the end, of course, then they can come up with a better chance of diagnosing what the problem is for the total body. Now, in science, of course, what's happened is that people have become specialists in CO2 or methane. And one of the places where I first realized this problem, Kim, was that a farmer was talking to me one day, and I said, these people selling chemicals for your soil, why do you trust them? And he said, well, they're the only ones that can tell me about my soil. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I had a problem with my soils. I went to the university, to the department that I thought was right, and they said, oh, no, we don't do soils. We got a guy that can help you with nematodes, which are little worms that are important in the soil formation. We can talk to you about trace minerals like zinc or copper, but we got no soils person. In other words, what they're saying is we've got no generalists. We've got all these specialists. The analogy I like to use for the environment and for climate is that everybody's got a piece of the puzzle, but we've lost the box top. And then if you take that analogy a bit further where you're trying to redo the puzzle, we haven't even got the four corner pieces, which is the standard way that you start to do a puzzle. The four corner pieces being the total cosmology, the space, and then the atmosphere, and then the oceans, and then the planet itself. We haven't even got accurate information on those four corner pieces yet. So we know there's four corner pieces, but we don't know the shape of them. We've only got a few of the edge pieces, and all we've been able to do is pile some of the inner pieces into different colors. And we haven't even done that accurately. So when you start to look at this problem of specialization and how it's had an impact upon climate science and our understanding of the world, you start to see why they've been able to get away with what's happened. Steve McIntyre, who was the guy that discovered the problems with the hockey stick graph, now that was the graph that came out in the 2001 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and it showed temperatures pretty constant for 1,000 years, then suddenly an uptick in the 20th century. And they presented this as proof that it was humans caused global warming. McIntyre was at a conference, and it wasn't a climate conference. It was a conference where they were talking about graphical presentation of material. And this graph was put up on the PowerPoint, and he looked at it, and he knew instantly how they'd achieved that graph, what they'd done to manipulate it. So after the conference, he went to dig into the climate material and, of course, ended up nailing it down, showing how they had thrown out 94% of the data that they had because it didn't give the result they wanted. How if a tree ring showed temperature going down in the 20th century, they threw it out and they plugged in tree rings that showed it going up in the 20th century, and that was the part of what was called the trick in the emails that were leaked, or the other phrase for it was hide the decline. Well, McIntyre was a specialist, and he knew nothing about climate science, but he spotted misuse of his particular area of expertise. So what we've tried to do in the book is I've given this preamble in an introduction and then in a large chapter explaining the motives, why they did this, and how they did it, and the ideas about climate as a generalist discipline. And then the other chapters are written by individual specialists. So, for example, one person looking at the concept of energy coming into the earth and going out of the earth. And we talked about that earlier when I talked about the greenhouse effect. And one of the things that he points out in that chapter, and again, virtually nobody knows this, but in their computer models, they assume that the Earth is a flat disk. You want to start talking about flat Earth society. And they assume that the sun's energy is evenly distributed over that flat disk. This is so guaranteeing a false result that you don't even need to go on any further. And as I pointed out to him when I reviewed the chapter for him, I said, I want you to add in the fact that not only is it not a flat disk, it's spherical, And that introduces a whole other level of geometry called topology. And it's a spinning sphere as well. And so you want to start